Hello, welcome to our filmmaker space, talking about our processes from the different aspects of filmmaking. And here, I'm so privileged to talk about music because it's a really important element in the film. And so happy to have our composer, soundscape artist, visionary, and race discussion supporter, just so many things. Manman, so we're going to be talking about that. So welcome, Manman, to our space to share about your process.
Hi, thank you, Crystal. It's always such a pleasure to work with you, and I always value our friendship because remember us meeting in Honolulu, and you were the kind of the only friend that I could speak Cantonese with, and just laughed about everything.
Yeah, with my broken one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember me emailing you sometimes or texting you, how do we say this? And yeah, how do I pronounce this properly? Remember?
Right? Yep. And
Yeah.
remember Riata, and we turned around and spoke like some awkward Cantonese English.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
hi, my name is Manman, and I use they them theirs as my pronouns. And I am originally from Hong Kong. I am the composer, but I also did some soundscaping. I like to use that word because with my background in research in soundscape design, and yeah, and Crystal and I did a lot of unpacking um, throughout the process of this project because I remember really well at the beginning when we started really working on the composition. It was actually at the beginning of COVID,
Hmm.
and I personally was verbally assaulted in my own neighborhood,
Wow.
and it's that was a lot because like the world was kind of falling apart, and
When you say verbally insulted for being Asian,
yes, and
so
it
this is
was a,
before all that anti-Asian hate crime stuff.
well, I don't know if you recall, like at the beginning of COVID, there was a surge in anti-Asian hate crime. That was 1 year before the Atlanta incidents happened. And because COVID, like of how the media or the Trump administration portrayed like as a Chinese virus, and there were a lot of hate targeting Asian American. And I remember walking, entering a grocery stores. I was the only person wearing masks at the time, and people would be staring. And one day I was rehearsing at the park because we couldn't meet in person to rehearse. And then an older white man approached me and start like saying slurs at me, and it actually took me a very long time to process that because at the time in the moment I was in survival mode. I just kept going because I was in charge of the rehearsal. I just ignored this man, and it actually took me months to really start unpacking the impact of that. I didn't feel safe to go outside of my home for a very long time. I didn't feel safe to just, yeah, in my own neighborhood, in the space where I
Wow.
live.
I'm
I
glad you shared that because this resonates with a lot of people who are listening because of what's going on now. I mean, there's just increasing amount of cases. And I mean, it's always been there, but it's just been more visible now and people are documenting it and talking about it. And so speaking to our film is that us kind of unraveling the past, the histories, these untold stories actually kind of speak to today's Afro-Asian tensions too, in a way, or like how Asians are viewed or why our voices are not heard and all these things, right? And so I'm so glad that you get a chance to talk about not just your music, as you mentioned, soundscape. The idea of designing sound for me was so intriguing, and I hope you can share a little bit of that process. Like how do you think, like when we worked together, we talked a lot about, how are we going to find that main theme, but beyond the theme, like what kind of sounds, how did you feel, like what was your process in thinking out what the suitable way to find that tone in certain areas was?
Right. So I remember you approached me saying you want Taiko. in
Yes.
this film. And I think that was, I mean, I would go into more later. I think like in terms of how Taiko is kind of perfect with the history of Taiko's the civil rights movement. But in terms of the tone and sound, I'm going to share a clip in a moment. And at first, I didn't actually think too much about, like, I actually went into more internal space to process, because your original title of the documentary when you first approached me was called Unruly
That's
Chinese Women.
right.
And I actually took that, like, because as a gender non-binary person assigned to female at birth, even though I don't identify as a woman, the society look at me, like, still perceived me as a woman. So I do experience the gender oppression, like both, like the compounded
Yeah.
oppression of being both, like being perceived as women, Asian women, and then also being gender non-binary.
Yeah.
And um, it was actually at the beginning of COVID, and I went camping in the woods, and so maybe I should just show
Yeah.
this.
Share the clip and give us a little sense of that inner world of yours because it comes from a very personal place.
Right. Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Seemed quite emotional there.
so yeah, I only showed 20
Yeah.
seconds of that for me. It's actually I recorded a lot of the stuff like this one. I did some movement. I'm also a dancer. I love improvisation and expression through movement.
Yeah.
This one in particular, it's actually where the theme came from. I was improvising, and the instruments that I use is called uchiwa daiko, which means fan drum, and traditionally it was used in Buddhist chanting, Shinto ceremony chanting in Japanese culture. Um, I mean, I've never really practiced it that way, but I really like how, like, the intimacy. I was really close to the camera, and I was holding the Uchiwa Daiko. Usually use a stick to play, but I just decided to
Mhm.
start processing um, all the emotions and pain that, like, I didn't even have the word pain at the time. I just, like, the world, the, like, with COVID, with the oppressions that we witness and experience, and I think it's also close to the time when Black Lives Matter movement gaining more tractions, and the protest, and it's just everything, um, the complexity of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's quite haunting. And I had chills when I was watching that again because it's so beautiful and haunting to have a sense of something that you can't quite articulate in words, but you can express through sound that's going to embody all these mixed emotions and feelings that you're getting from not just your personal kind of emotional state at the time, but also things around you that are affecting you, right? And that's what music does. And the way you use that seed kind of sounds and weave that into the film in a way, and we worked back and forth. And I remember because sometimes I felt like it was too much focusing on the woman's, because that was my process too. I was like trying to figure out my thread, right? And I was focusing too much on the women's stories, their inner world, which you showed there. But then I wanted to address the larger issues of racism because of Black Lives Matter. So do you mind talking a little bit about that and how we kind of worked in the Taiko and why that speaks to race relations?
Right. And it's actually really interesting how I follow your shift too, because I follow you to, okay, unpack, like, like gender oppression, and then and so and also technically in terms of the technicality, it's hard to score with voices when there's a lot of dialogue with like documentary. So we have to consider that when we were producing the music too. And so I am a huge fan of polyrhythm, polymeter music, and I remember you and I have a really deep conversation about that, and I don't always bring that terms out because so a lot of my influence, I need to credit my friend, Jacqueline Rago. She's a Venezuelan artist, musician, that I met actually in the Bay Area about 10 years ago. And she introduced me to this music called Kitibla from Venezuela. And and this is just one of the many type of music. I also used to practice gamelan in college, Balinese gamelan, and I'm always in love with music that have this really strong interconnection. That like there's parts that is like um, every there's so many different parts. It's almost like they're on their own. They're completely clashing each other with each other, but then when they're coming together, there is actually a harmony in that chaos. And that's kind of how I see.
Would you say that's how you define polyrhythm for people who don't know what that means?
Yeah, so yeah, polyrhythm is actually more like a Western Eurocentric terminology to understand that, because like in the Western European style of music, always think about like there's need to be a time signature, and majority of the music that we listen today, it's in like 4/4, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like and very straightforward, and then and um, but then there are so many different types of music, or just go out in the nature, which if you listen to frogs singing, they don't sing in pace, right? If you go walk on the street and like if you just sit out in the nature, you hear the birds and the trees and the wind and everything. It doesn't not everything will go in this beat, right? Our heartbeat too, right? And so basically polyrhythm is like you have multiple lines of music that happening at the same time, that it's in a different time. Like for example, some are in 3 and then some are in 2, and then they come together, become like the rhythm that it's like they're maybe in some way in language like saying that they are in dissonance, but actually they are interconnecting as a bigger picture that is in harmony with each other. It's like you have to find that drive and groove to be moving along together. So which is why I picked that too, because when I watched the documentary, at the beginning, Crystal, you have this driving energy of like like you're like, let me ask this question, let me go out and like dig through this, and I feel like there is that same feeling of energy. So what ended up happening was I applied this like polyrhythm drumming, taiko drumming, and then I put the original melody like on top of that, which is kind of like maintaining the voices of the women, like or feminine voices, or oppressed, gender oppressed voices, and then with this chaotic harmony, and that energy of like driving us forward, going somewhere.
I love that, because you're addressing how to work with a director, first of all, like to try to find that kind of like that tone that you think that I want, but at the same time addressing what the film really is about, and having, to highlight both the individual voices, which we do, in addition to the larger collective voices and the conflicting collective voices, because we're talking about the relationship between the Black and Chinese community. And maybe I can share a clip too about, the riot scene was kind of like the climactic scene where it builds a lot of tension. And we worked back and forth on that one quite a lot. How do we build with this taiko? But I also, or maybe we should do the model minority one, because that's the one where you kind of played with how it starts as a kind of like, how do you insert you don't just play the music, right? You just you have to play with the visuals, and when it's the suitable time to enter with a music voice, and how that kind of communicates with the visuals. It's like this relationship, right? So do you mind if I share a little bit of maybe I'll do the model minority clip. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, it's a little messy on my screen, but we're going out of order here. All right, let's play this one.
So how did you all feel about this particular position of the Chinese going to white schools, going to white churches, and living in the Black neighborhood? How do you make sense of the situation then?
We just accepted them and love them and love their culture.
So first we listen to them talk, and then you bring it in later. So it's just interesting to observe how the music plays into the scene.
I've just had Chinese around. I just accepted the Chinese, that I didn't think that much about it.
Were we really accepted? Accepted to what? I do appreciate how the First Baptist Church welcomes the Chinese community, but are we supposed to be grateful that we weren't treated like Black people? I never really understood this before, but this is exactly that model minority myth we bought into. An inaccurate and harmful stereotype created by white Americans to basically drive a wedge and shame other minority groups. A belief that plays into anti-Black racism. We learned that if we keep quiet, work hard, follow rules, we would gain this honorary white status. I get it. Back then, survival was priority and inclusion was a part of survival. But I don't want to be some honorary white.
Okay, so it's interesting because you hear it come in as a soft taiko first, and then you started building layers on that. Can you talk a little bit about your process of how you worked with that scene and how to not overshadow the narration and yet supporting it in a way that brings another level of tension?
Right. Yeah, I remember that scene really well because we kept going back and forth quite a bit. And I remember when my collaborator, Amy and Heidi, we were working on that, we both agreed, because that moment actually has a lot to unpack. Like, even though the two-person that you were interviewing say that they were welcoming the Chinese, but there's still a tone of ordering Chinese, like, as in Chinese is still being the guest, like being the people that don't belong, and then I take you in.
Yeah.
And then I also remember the camera angle, just looking at your family and the way that kind of pain that also, like, well, thank you for welcoming me, but then no. And I remember that when we watched that, I was like, I actually don't want to put a lot of sound there because there's so much. Like, I remember we talked about silence, like the power of silence, of just that moment. I don't want to take that away from like just that camera angle and the cut. And so, which we then decide to let's layer in, because you were also, as we were witnessing that moment, we need to sit with that. We need space to sit with that. And then we gradually build up the tension because you were also introducing that questions for us to reflect. Like, I don't want to be model minority. Like, who, why? Like, then there's so much underlying tension with that terms model minority between like white supremacy, like and then also pitting the Black community and Chinese community against each other.
And I don't feel like it's tension to say like the obvious definition of tension in that music in that particular scene. I feel like it's more like it's offering questions. It's like it's laying out some issues somehow. It's not defining things for you. Right. That's how I felt that scene worked.
Right. And also a big part of it is also like battling against erasure, because we've always live in a world to tell us to conform, to get in line, to stay in line, to follow in line, and don't rock the boat. But in reality, as we're all have different history, our own struggles, and with like intersectionality and different forms of oppressions and privilege. And so like that all come together, like that's the tension, that the balance, the tension that exists.
Yeah.
And like, and to embrace that chaos, to sit with that,
Yeah.
it's important.
Yeah.
Like, because if we push it aside, then it's erasure. Then we can't break the cycle of harm.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to use music to unpack all that complexity, is by having, sometimes when you use the handpan, which was a new discovery for me, I never knew about this instrument, and it turned out to be my favorite one, and you ended up using that for like to reflect on certain things that you felt was like my voice. And then we have the taiko for the larger kind of the more obvious conflicts that come together in the riot scene I had mentioned. Can we go back? I just want to share one more clip, because I felt like in the beginning we're talking about one of the original focuses was the women's stories, and it still is quite dominant in the film, but I took back on a lot of the women's voice. But can we speak to that? Like, you know, how you worked with that and how you felt about that, you know, because historically, especially in Asian societies, the woman has been silenced. And how do you feel that the music is a way to treat this? And how did you treat it in the film?
Yeah, well, I remember when you asked me the question, like, how can we, because like the original tones of the music felt like too reflective, or, and then I remember I pointed out, well, like your stories is being told this way, but then we could also reflect your voice, like your feminine approach, like with like the feminist lens. And one of the things that I really want to uplift is, I love how the original intention of you telling the story is to highlight or contribute representation of Asian women, that from that era, because we always, because of like this Orientalism, like putting Asian women as like fragile, submissive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's also, you know, patriarchy and in Chinese culture too.
Right. Right.
But then you show there's a whole different side, like of like looking into the story of your grandmother, like,
right.
like running away from home.
Yeah,
and,
the defiance of structure.
Right, and then also there's a scene that like you were able to keep in this current cut, is like you just see these women all dressed up and having this flamboyance and enjoying life, like given what they could.
Yeah.
And I remember like we actually play with that. We found music that kind of represent that euphoria.
Yeah.
Even they were under a lot of repression and live in a world that it's heavily divided.
And that's the thing, you know, talking about like blurring and in between spaces and just looking at things from a different lens, is when you allow yourself to enter those spaces, it's so rich, right? We can zoom in and sift out the details, and then you can elaborate from that very small space and turn it into something really special. Maybe I share one more clip, then maybe we can talk about that, and maybe that's the one you're referring to. Is this the one? Do you remember? Yeah. Okay, let's just play it and then we can talk about your music.
But you know what I find interesting? They only snuck out with white boys. Why not Chinese? They were too familiar, too accessible.
They were all ugly.
Maybe they represented a kind of rigidity, control.
You guys never went with Black people, right?
Never, never bother.
Not even a friend?
No, thumbs down.
Yeah, but you're surrounded by Black people.
But we don't bother with them. No.
It's like the white boys were the reversed exotic other to have fun with before ending up in a loveless marriage. My grandma Pearl had her secret date all planned out.
你記得他個台 Jenny 嘛？We used to call her 黃婆 remember? Because she had white skin, she was a mixture. Oh, you had dinner at her house with Russell. You remember Russell? The Saiyan guy that used to work for Smith and Company. Jenny would cook dinner for you, and you go to her house to have dinner.
I love that my grandma snuck out, but there's something more troubling about this unequal distribution of power that this story reveals. Think about it. A white boy entering Black space to date a Chinese girl. Pearl felt the need to break away from her controlling parents. Jenny, her neighbor, might have wanted to improve her relations with the storekeepers as a paying customer. And Russell? Well, he had no risks or concerns because he was white.
Okay, I'm not sure if that's the clip that you were referring to, but it's interesting because we have two pieces of music that were not originally composed, but you had to think out how to represent these films, these scenes, and you selected this Chinese song. Maybe talk about that process and why that fit.
Yeah, so I went through a phase in my college life that I love listening to really old Chinese jazz music from the 30s. And there's this really interesting tone and sound, and like there's that I don't know how would you describe that like sexual yeah, like
Do you associate it with like the Shanghai 1930s kind of feel, right? It's that the height of like women's owning their own bodies and really being able to celebrate that in a way.
right, and also just the mixture of music, because I think that's part of the reason why I'm really drawn to Taiko too. As in, well, first to this scene because like we're talking about like these Chinese women, when they were in their like youthful 20s and exploring life and
sexuality, right? In their terms, right? Yeah.
Right, and we needed some sound that represent that, the soundscape, right? That we talk about what back in their days, what do they listen to?
Right.
What represent like their energy?
Yeah.
And one thing that as I was watching the scene also recall is there's this Asian Americanness. There is this also maybe not just Asian American, but like me growing up in the colonial British like Hong Kong, also experienced that mixture of culture music. Because like when we listen to this, there's jazz influence, jazz like which is like Black American music, and then there is some like there's also whiteness in that too, and then there is Chineseness. And then with my experience with Taiko's also it's like a huge representation of Asian Americanness because Taiko as a music art form that people play as a musical instruments actually like became popular during the civil rights movement because a lot of Japanese American like took to Taiko as their healing space from what happened during the World War II when a big group of Japanese American were incarcerated. And so there's all this layers of representation of reminding us, hey, American culture is a lot more than what we look to Hollywood. There's so much more. Like, of course. Music that we hear just now or Taiko music, they are all representation of Asian American or American culture. They're a part of American culture.
Yeah. But for us to dig for that one piece to be the exact one to put in there was kind of quite a process. And even the English song, I mean, that was inspired by my Aunt Lorraine, who we believe that's the song she sang when she snuck out to play in a radio contest or something like that. But so again, there's that historical context that you want to bring in, right? Can we add one more issue that I wanted to address is the concept of silence. Like you talk about soundscape, and how does silence play its role in the form of your soundscape? It's obvious to critique the music that you create for it, but what about the spaces that are not filled with music? How do you speak to that? Like, because there certain intentional spaces where you said this cannot have music there, and why? Not just because of the narration, but what is the feel? Like, why do you need silence?
That's a really good question. Silence. We are living in a society that rejects silence or
Yeah,
forget
we can't have that
as
those
acceptable.
moments. Yeah.
Like we often feel like we tend to always fill silence with something.
Yeah, look at those stupid Hollywood blockbusters. It's bam, 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 all this charging music. It's crazy.
Yeah, I get so tired watching Hollywood movie because of this, like, give
Yeah.
me some space. And so this is actually has some personal connection. Is I actually live with a condition called situational mutism.
Mm.
So when I was a kid, majority of my childhood, I couldn't speak outside of my family, so I could only speak to my parents and my grandmother who used to take care of me. Um, I most of my childhood I lived my childhood in silence. I like verbal language was not. It's still not the most comfortable form of communication for me, and and I love this saying. When there's nothing, there's everything.
Mm.
So when we actually allowed ourselves to sit with silence, there's so much happening around us. For me, I mean, there are many different people, their experience with situational mutism is different.
Mhm.
For me, is I have so much that I'm processing: the sound, the smell, the
Right.
emotions, interactions, textures, and space sensory stimulations, and everything. And sometimes you just need to give it space for it
Yeah.
to manifest, for us to sit with that. And for your documentary here, there's so much to unpack, but we've
Yeah.
learned to push it aside, not to like. And as Asian American marginalized gender people, we've taught to ignore our own pain and
Mm.
not prioritize our own needs. But actually, we can take the space to sit with the silence and to allow ourselves to unpack and heal from it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really interesting how we kind of play with that theme in the form of sound in the film as well. And it also silent space is kind of emphasized or highlight when you do have the music spaces. It's like when we talk about the black and white spaces, right? You don't have the reason the kind of white supremacist structure is created and is so powerful is because they use the Black community or all the other ethnic communities as the margins. So they highlight the white center power. And I feel like there's that, distinction sometimes that it brings to clarity what's on the other side, if you will. Not to create these binaries, because I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about is all a mixture of so many things. But I think just to highlight that silence is kind of an interesting way of playing with how we address race relations is also, because Chinese are very quiet and it doesn't mean they have nothing to say, like you had said earlier. And we have historically been kind of silenced by patriarchal power. But it doesn't mean that the Chinese women didn't have thoughts and desires. So yeah, I mean, I guess to wrap it up, what do you want to share about your music, in reference to the film, and what you think people should take out of it or take away from it? What do you want people to hear?
That's a really loaded question. Well, I invite people to sit with the discomfort and silence, and maybe the questions that you hear, the sound that you hear, would like just allow yourself to feel the emotions. And we all live in a world that like no matter what color of your skin, we all live in a world that is constructed in a way that marginalized. We all have our own trauma to heal from, and I hope that like the music and sound, the soundscape, and also the audio visual experience from this documentary is it's to open up that to for you to unpack. Like, and I invite you to sit with that discomfort, even though it might be difficult.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
we don't need to fix this right now. We actually
Right. There's no right answer.
right. What we need to do is allow us to feel when we've been told not to for too
Yeah.
long.
Yeah. Yeah. So let the voices come to us.
And
Yeah.
And I definitely want to thank, like, because it's not just me. I'm here representing a team of people that put
For
this
sure.
together. And yeah, and I really appreciate, like, well, Crystal for bringing me in and trusting me to, like, I want to bring this and Heidi,
Oh yeah.
Gary, and Mujo Creative in, like, to represent. And I also carefully choose people that I want to uplift, even though, yeah, it's just a sound bites that pass by in the film. But I do invite everyone who watched the documentary to stay until the end and read the credit, to just recognize the people that have contributed their labor and
Yes.
love.
Agree. Yeah, no, thank you too. And it's all a process. And I really enjoyed this process of working with you. And I learned so much using music as kind of a metaphor for larger dialogue that even the film addresses on you know, on the surface level even. So there's so much depth to music. Just thank you for unpacking just a little bit of it. I know we can talk on forever. Maybe we'll do another like series to unpack some other parts of it. But thank you so much for your time. This is Manman, the wonderful composer of Blurring the Color Line.
Thank you.